Hi there. In this discussion, we're going to go over the concept of the Supreme Court swing voter. And we're going to talk about why it is that recent battles over presidential nominees for the court, first, President Obama's failed effort to secure Justice Merrick Garland's nomination to the Supreme Court, and then President Trump's successful appointment of both Justice Neil Gorsuch and Justice Brett Kavanaugh have produced such extraordinary partisan warfare. And to explain some of that, we'll talk about the concept of the swing voter and how it is that changes in the composition of the court can shift the center of the court's power, and in so doing, shape the direction of the court ideologically for years, if not decades to come. In order for us to do that, we're going to answer a series of pretty interesting questions about the Supreme Court and swing voters on the Supreme Court. We'll begin with a very simple discussion of who are swing voters in the Supreme Court and why are they so important. And we'll draw on a recent example of a very famous and prominent Supreme Court Justice, Anthony Kennedy, who was, for a very long time, the important swing voter on the court. We'll then ask the question of how and why do potential changes to swing voters produce such partisan warfare. We'll look at why it is that changes in the ideological composition of the court caused by adding a new member can really shape the fundamental ideological orientation of the court by shifting its center of power. And we'll talk about why that has such extraordinary implications for both conservatives and liberals in American politics. We'll explore how and why Senate partisan control and the changing filibuster rules for Supreme Court nominees has impacted the politics of judicial confirmation. And then we'll explore how President Trump's recent installation of Justices Gorsuch and Kavanaugh have impacted the court itself. How, if at all, it's changed the center of power in the court by shifting its ideological balance. So we'll address a number of really interesting questions. To begin, it's useful to briefly review the concept of ideology in the court. Legal experts traditionally divide the court along a left and right divide, and conservative justices, typically are thought to vote in a block. Liberal justices also vote in a block. And on divided courts, especially when there's a relatively even distribution between the liberal and the conservative bloc, power rests in the centermost judge, who casts the tie-breaking vote most often in 5-4 decisions. That centrist judge, who is the frequent voter in these 5-4 decisions, is known as the swing judge, or the swing vote on the court. Now, what you can see here is that the ideological composition of the court changes from one year to the next. In 1967 to 1969, after the JFK LBJ appointments, there was a very, very sizable block of liberal justices working and making common cause with each other, and a very small coalition of 2 conservative justices who had both been appointed by Dwight Eisenhower. Moving forward, you can see that in some years, after, for example, the Nixon Ford appointments in 1975, 1981, there's a large centrist bloc in the court and relatively small liberal or conservative factions. Jumping to today, we can see that from Clinton forward, there's been a shrinking center to the court and a growing and fairly balanced divide between conservative and liberal factions. So under Clinton, both Sandra Day O'Connor and Justice Anthony Kennedy were the centrists of the court. And for much of the last 15 years or more, for the last 15 years, the swing voter has been Anthony Kennedy, who is the centrist sitting between the conservative faction led by Chief Justice John Roberts and the liberal faction of the court. To explain the logic of why we think swing voters are important, it's useful for us to step back to the Supreme Court that persisted. I know I said 15 years, but for 10 years, when Anthony Kennedy was the swing voter. So as recently as early 2016, the US Supreme Court looked like this. We had a conservative coalition on the court, as I said, led by Chief Justice John Roberts, and at the time, before he passed away, Justice Antonin Scalia, Justice Clarence Thomas, and Justice Samuel Alito. And to varying degrees, these judges tend to be strict adherents to the Constitution. They want the text to be clear. There's no need to look for legislative intent. And they typically think of the Constitution is creating a federal government with limited federal powers. You have a liberal coalition here again, led by, well, not led, but populated by Justice Sonia Sotomayor, Elena Kagan, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and Stephen Breyer, who have a more expansive view of federal government power, typically are willing to take a more expansive interpretation of whether a law is constitutional by looking beyond the text of the Constitution to legislative history. And for much of the decade leading up to 2016, the swing vote was Justice Anthony Kennedy. Anthony Kennedy was a pragmatist. He was, by and large, a moderate conservative justice, more conservative than he was liberal, appointed by Reagan. But he was also a pragmatist, and he was very frequently the one who was the deciding vote between these liberal and conservative coalitions. How do we know that Justice Kennedy was the swing voter? Well, we can look at some basic data on the number of times one member of the conservative dominant coalition of the court cast a vote with the liberal faction. So the number of times that a member of the conservative coalition crossed over to create a majority with the four justices on the left. And as you can see here, from 2005 until I believe around 2016, John Roberts was only the swing justice exactly one time. It was a very important case on healthcare reform, where he preserved the constitutionality of Obamacare, but nonetheless, that single case was the only time that John Roberts acted as the swing voter, making the critical majority with the four voters on the left. Clarence Thomas and Antonin Scalia have only been the swing voter twice. Samuel Alito in that period had never been the swing voter. And here we see that Anthony Kennedy had been the deciding vote in 5-4 decisions with the liberal faction of the court 25 times. So he clearly was playing a crucial role as the swing. Now, note that he's siding with the conservative majority more often, but he is the person who is most frequently the critical vote for either of the two coalitions. Now, Kennedy, in his tenure at the court, as the swing voter, cast crucial votes across a number of issue areas, and there's too many for us to cover here, but you can see how a swing voter can be a critical vote for both liberal and conservative causes. In Planned Parenthood v. Casey in 1992, it was Justice Kennedy who cast the deciding vote in the decision to reaffirm the right to abortion. In Roe v. Simmons in 2005, he was the deciding vote in a decision that banned the death penalty for juveniles. In Citizens United v. FEC, Kennedy's vote was the critical vote that ended limits on political spending, that curtailed limits that government had tried to impose on campaign finance. In Obergefell v. Hodges in 2015, his was the beautifully written deciding vote to legalize gay marriage. And in perhaps one of the most famous or infamous, depending on how you see it, decisions ever issued by a very divided court, he, along with Sandra Day O'Connor, were the critical votes in Bush v. Gore, which handed the contested presidential election to George W. Bush. Even though if you study the history of the vote in Florida, which was under dispute, it very much seems as though, well, is the case that Al Gore would have won the presidential election. So the Supreme Court, in this case, issue was widely viewed to be a very partisan decision to appoint the Republican candidate, George W. Bush, president, to decide that he had won the presidency by stopping a recount that might have otherwise led Al Gore to win the presidency. So Kennedy, as a swing voter, was influential across areas. Now, one of the really interesting things in the modern court are the extraordinary partisan politics that erupt over judicial vacancies. And this first erupted under President Obama in his final year of office with the unexpected death of Antonin Scalia, a giant of the conservative legal movement, a consistently conservative justice, and he passed away unexpectedly in February of 2016. Now, when this happened, it set off an epic appointment battle. President Obama was in the final year of his second term, no longer eligible for re-election. In fact, a presidential primary was unfolding at the time of Scalia's death. And yet, President Obama, as president, has the prerogative to nominate someone to replace this vacancy on the court. The Senate, as you know, is controlled by Republican majority under the leadership of Mitch McConnell, very conservative, and for whom judicial appointments is his life's project in the Senate. Obama's ability to fill this unexpected vacancy had extraordinary implications for the battle of the courts, and triggers an epic partisan battle that's going to unfold for the final months of the Obama administration, as well as the first years of the Trump administration. To explain it, it's really helpful to look at the conservative and liberal coalitions on the court on this ideological continuum. Here you can see that you have on the conservative coalition, Thomas, viewed as the most conservative justice, Alito, Scalia, Roberts, and Kennedy, the swing. Notice Kennedy still right of center. And then you have the liberal coalition, Kagan, Breyer, Sotomayor, and Ginsburg. Now, Obama is on this list to show you where, were we to place him ideologically on the spectrum, he would be. And, by estimates, Obama would, were he a Supreme Court justice, he would be the most liberal justice on the bench. Now, why does this matter? It matters because if we think that Obama was set to nominate his ideal justice, the person Obama thought was going to be someone who matched his ideological preferences perfectly, it would end up being the most left-leaning justice on the bench. And note something crucial, it would also fundamentally change the swing votes. Here we have a situation where Scalia has departed, and now you have 4 conservatives on the bench, offset by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 liberals on the bench. The change in the swing is gigantic ideologically. You're moving from Kennedy in this situation being the swing voter all the way over to Justice Kagan being the swing voter. So a radical shift in the power of the court, because were Obama to succeed in nominating his preferred justice, you would pull the winning coalition away from this moderate conservative swing vote, Kennedy, who most frequently is making common alliance with the conservatives, and instead install a liberal majority on the court with a liberal swing voter. And to illustrate, this would represent in the way we chart it, the relative change, potential change in the median justice. So the potential change from Kennedy being the median justice to Kagan being the median justice would have been, had Obama succeeded, the largest such swing in American history. In other words, the relative conservatism of Scalia and the shift in the court's composition by imposing Obama's preferred liberal justice would have been gigantic and fairly significantly changed the ideological orientation of the majority coalition of the court. Now, before we keep going, it's worth noting that Obama chose not to nominate a justice who matched his own ideology perfectly. He nominated a man named Merrick Garland, who was sitting on the DC Circuit Court for Appeals. And Garland was very well respected, admired by conservatives and liberals. And Garland likely would have fallen to the right of Kagan. He may well have been the next swing vote on the court. Nonetheless, it was going to shift power away from a coalition of Republican appointees towards a coalition of Democratic liberal appointees. Well, this sets off a battle. Obama nominates Merrick Garland to the court, and Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell declares any nominee appointment by a sitting president to be null and void. Now remember, the Senate is in charge with advising and consenting to the president's nominee for the court. They have to vote to approve it. And McConnell takes an unorthodox position of arguing that the position should be filled not by President Obama, but by whoever is the winner of the November 2016 presidential election. Well, Scalia departed in February of 2016. This is well over 200 days until the next presidential election, and well into January until that next president would take power. There's nothing in the Constitution that says a sitting president cannot nominate a Supreme Court justice if it's an election year. In fact, the position held by McConnell broke from precedent. He did something unimaginable. Obama made the nomination of Merrick Garland to the court, and what McConnell chose to do was nothing at all. McConnell breaks precedent by ignoring the nomination entirely. He refuses to hold hearings or a vote on nominations, on Garland's nomination, and says famously, "One of my proudest moments in his career was when I looked Barack Obama in the eye and I said, 'Mr. President, you will not fill the Supreme Court vacancy.'" Because McConnell and the Republicans controlled the Senate, they just obstructed. They just refused to even hold a hearing. Now, I think this is an interesting question for the Constitution. The Constitution requires that the Senate advise the president on potential nominees and consent to the president's nominee. But what happens if the Senate just simply refuses to act at all? Not advise nor participate in consent, which is what they do. Not even a hearing, no public stance against the nominee, just a flat out refusal to consider it at all. Well, as you'll see, McConnell prevails, but he prevails at some cost to judicial norms. So here we'll have a peek at some graphs, and you can see that although McConnell argued that there should be no appointment of a new Supreme Court justice during an election year, it was certainly not unheard of. In fact, President Reagan himself nominated Anthony Kennedy, and Anthony Kennedy was confirmed during a presidential election year. So Republicans had gained the prior swing voter through an appointment that happened in an election year. And as you can see in this graph, there have been 6 justices confirmed during a presidential election year since the year 1900. So certainly far from unheard of. More importantly, the majorities of the public favored the president's nomination. You can see that 46% of the public, a plurality, sorry, not majority, a plurality of the public favored Merrick Garland's nomination. Only 30% said that he shouldn't be confirmed, and 24% didn't know or refused. And interestingly, strong majority of Democrats favored it, but the plurality of independent voters did too. So McConnell was clearly taking a gamble, but understanding the significant change that Merrick Garland's successful appointment to the court would have on the court's composition, you can, even if you don't agree with McConnell's decision, understand why he viewed the stakes as so high. Now, what happens is, shockingly to American political pundits in 2016, President Trump won the presidential election in 2016. And you have Mitch McConnell suddenly presiding over a expected Senate confirmation process for justices with unified government, a strong Republican majority in the Senate, and a strong Republican president, and although it doesn't bear on this particular decision, a Republican House of Representatives. So McConnell's first victory is that Trump's election paves way for the nomination and appointment of Neil Gorsuch. To secure the nomination, however, the Republicans actually had to change the rules for a Senate confirmation. The partisan warfare didn't end there. Instead, they had to change the rules for judicial confirmation votes. Historically, leading up until the Neil Gorsuch nomination, the Senate had followed traditional rules of filibuster and cloture, meaning that for the Senate to agree to have a vote on a Supreme Court justice, you first had to get 60 senators to agree to end debate and hold the vote. Democrats were livid that President Obama's appointment of Merrick Garland hadn't been allowed to go through, and threatened to filibuster McConnell's nomination. Sorry for that interruption. So to secure Gorsuch's successful appointment to the court, Republicans had to change the filibuster rule. Democrats were livid, had threatened to filibuster and prevent Trump from making the nomination. So Republicans did. They changed the voting rule to a simple majority, breaking the Democrats' ability to filibuster the nomination of Neil Gorsuch that Trump had made for the court, and were able to secure a successful appointment to the Supreme Court, but at a very high cost. They broke from established precedent where at Supreme Court level, they had preserved the filibuster for Supreme Court nominees, and at a cost. It amplified concern when they did this, when they first blocked Merrick Garland's appointment and then pushed through Neil Gorsuch's appointment, concern that the court was becoming itself an increasingly political and partisan body. And as you can see here, Gorsuch's vote, his confirmation in 2017 with 54% voting aye, was, among the more partisan votes, especially considering that there hadn't been the hurdle of filibuster to clear before. Now, what's interesting is that, very shortly after Scalia's death, there was round 2 of this epic Supreme Court appointment battle. In 2018, Justice Kennedy retired, opening up the position of the swing voter. The swing voter himself is now going to step back. He submitted his resignation, and Trump was able to appoint another replacement, this time nominating Justice Brett Kavanaugh to sit in the Supreme Court. Now, if you followed the Kavanaugh hearing, you'll know that it was a scandalous hearing, and that Democrats and members of the press did much to bring to light some of the accusations of sexual impropriety, sexual assault by Justice Kavanaugh. So it was a very contested event. But what's important to study in this particular discussion is that Justice Kavanaugh himself further becomes evidence of a partisan Supreme Court. He only gets 51% of votes in favor of confirmation, one of the closest confirmation votes for a Supreme Court justice. And if you look here, you can see that it is the 2 most recent votes, both Gorsuch and Kavanaugh, that never would have made it to the court had the Republicans preserved filibuster. So under Trump's tenure, the 2 justices that he is able to appoint are successes for the Republican Party, but they come at a cost. They come at a cost where historically, because of filibuster, justices had to be at least somewhat bipartisan in support, for people to agree to have a vote on a justice. And now they pass through simple majorities along partisan lines. And also because of how it went down, there's this amplification, this idea that the court is increasingly itself partisan. Now, the Supreme Court today is interesting because you have a conservative wing on the court. Notice I'm going to include 5 here. You have Thomas, you have Alito, you have Roberts, you have Gorsuch, and you have Kavanaugh, the newest member of the court, balanced out by the existing liberals, Sotomayor, Kagan, Ginsburg, and Breyer, who are both elderly members of the court, probably the next two to be replaced. And what is less clear right now is whether we have a single swing voter. The three potential swing voters are Justice John Roberts, although he's historically shown himself to be terribly conservative, Justice Gorsuch, or Justice Brett Kavanaugh. So who is going to be this next spring voter of the court? Well, you can understand why there's some uncertainty. These three justices are the closest to the pivot. They're closest to the center. You have Breyer and Kagan here on the left. You have Alito Thomas over here on the right. And over here, you have, I'm sorry for this redundant picture, you have Gorsuch, but then Roberts and Kavanaugh. So one of these three, and most likely Roberts and Kavanaugh, are going to emerge as the centermost justice. Now, when I say centermost, it doesn't mean that they're suddenly moderate. What it means is that the ideological bent of the court has been drifting to the right. They are more right than Kennedy ever was, but it just means that the new swing voter is further to the right. They're the closest to the center of the majority coalition. Kavanaugh is, by this charting, from more liberal to more conservative. He is now, following Kennedy, the most ideologically centrist of the judges. He's the new median, and he's an interesting pivot. So we had postulated that maybe Roberts, maybe Kennedy, or maybe Roberts, Gorsuch, or Kavanaugh would be the swing voter. Kavanaugh looks like he may emerge as a swing voter, in part because although he is reliably conservative, he doesn't always agree with members of the conservative faction. You can see that Kavanaugh agrees with Justice Gorsuch about as often as he agrees with Justice Kagan. So here's Kavanaugh's voting, and you can see he agrees, votes in pairs with Kagan and Gorsuch about the same time. So he may be positioned to behave as the swing voter. It's also certainly possible that Roberts, there's an argument that Roberts will become the new swing voter, especially if strategically he thinks doing so will help preserve the legitimacy of the court, something he is dedicated to. And although it seems less likely given the ideological spectrum, we do know that Justice Gorsuch, a newer member of the court, may himself show himself to be someone who reaches across lines and forms interesting coalitions with the voting bloc on the left. Most likely is that there's not going to be as cleanly a distilled swing voter as there was when Anthony Kennedy was the centermost voter of the court. Now, what do we learn about this? Well, Supreme Court decision making often depends on the presence of a swing voter, and the partisan battles that erupted between Mitch McConnell and Obama, and then between the minority Democrats in the Senate and Trump and Mitch McConnell on the right, were extraordinary battles, in part because the votes were going to shape, or potentially shape, the ideological center of the court. They were going to shift who was the pivotal or swing Supreme Court justice, and in so doing, shift the ideological direction. Obama could have shifted the court leftward for decades to come, or at least for years to come. And instead, Trump has the potential, especially if Ginsburg or Breyer steps down, to really entrench a very strong conservative majority of the court for years to come. Because of this, the court appears to be divided among partisan lines more than ever. And the failure of Obama and the ability of Trump and McConnell to make these appointments shifted the balance of the court in a significant way, making it much more conservative than it had been. And it was already tilted rightward. This may impact future decisions related to contemporary policy. For example, the court is, seen as likely to challenge Roe v. Wade, likely to overturn abortion protections. They certainly have a number of justices who would like that opportunity. They are more amenable to gun rights and more likely, as they've shown, to interpret gun rights as an individual right to bear arms protected by the US Constitution. And although perhaps less discussed, maybe even more important, the new justices especially are open to reimagining or rolling back the power of the administrative state. They are hostile to the independent power of the bureaucracy to make law without explicit congressional guidance and statutory authority. And so there is a possibility that the justices will begin to issue serious rulings that weaken the federal bureaucracy and its ability to shape and implement law. So really important stuff. I hope you enjoyed the discussion and look forward to reading your discussion comments.